Every decade has its visionaries, the men who look at the world and decide that standard isn't good enough. In the early 1970s, the automotive world was in a state of flux. The muscle car era was dying a slow, painful death under the weight of new emissions laws. The oil crisis was lurking just around the corner, and in Washington, safety regulators were tightening the noose around the neck of the high-performance automobile. Most manufacturers responded with smaller engines and massive, ugly rubber bumpers. But one man saw an opportunity. He didn't want to just build a car, he wanted to build the safest sports car the world had ever seen. A car with gull-wing doors, a body made of high-tech acrylic, and an integrated roll cage that could withstand a catastrophic impact. It was called the Bricklin SV1. SV for safety vehicle. It was supposed to be the future. It was supposed to revitalize the economy of a Canadian province. It was supposed to make Malcolm Bricklin the next Henry Ford. Instead, it became one of the most famous failures in automotive history. It was a car that could melt in the sun, trap its occupants inside if the battery died, and cost twice as much to build as it sold for. It was a dream that turned into a political nightmare, costing taxpayers millions and leaving a trail of broken promises from Arizona to New Brunswick. How did a man who successfully brought Subaru to America fail so spectacularly at building his own machine? Was the Bricklin SV1 a victim of bad timing, or was it a fundamentally flawed concept from the very first sketch? Today, we peel back the acrylic skin of a 1970s icon. This is the autopsy of a dream. This is the complete story of the Bricklin SV1.
To understand the Bricklin, you have to understand the company behind it, General Vehicle, Inc. This wasn't a subsidiary of the Big Three. This was an upstart, a disruptor, long before that word became a Silicon Valley cliché. The brand was built on a single intoxicating premise, the Safety Vehicle 1, SV1. At a time when cars were often referred to as unsafe at any speed, the Bricklin brand was marketed as the antidote. It was a performance car for the responsible adult. It was sleek, it was fast, at least on paper, but above all, it was designed to keep you alive. The company's identity was inseparable from its founder. General Vehicle didn't have a century of heritage like Ford or a massive R&D department like GM. It had Malcolm Bricklin's salesmanship. The brand was positioned as an outsider, a rebel with a cause. While the rest of Detroit was cutting corners, General Vehicle claimed to be building the car of tomorrow today. But the brand suffered from a fundamental paradox. It was a safety car that looked like a racing car. It was a luxury product built in a factory by workers who had never built a car in their lives. And as we will see, the General Vehicle name would eventually become synonymous not with safety, but with a massive financial sinkhole.
Who was the man behind the machine? Malcolm Bricklin was born in Philadelphia in 1939, and from the beginning, he was a natural-born entrepreneur. He didn't just sell products, he sold possibilities. By the age of 19, he had started a chain of hardware stores called Handyman. By his mid-20s, he was looking for the next big thing. He found it in an unlikely place, Japan. In the late 1960s, Bricklin founded Subaru of America. At the time, Japanese cars were seen as jokes in the U.S. market. The first model he imported, the Subaru 360, was described by Consumer Reports as unacceptably hazardous. It was a tiny, two-stroke ladybug of a car that struggled to reach highway speeds. But Bricklin's marketing genius was at work. He sold the car for under $1,300 and used the slogan, "Cheap and ugly does it." Against all odds, he established the Subaru footprint in North America. He walked away from Subaru a very wealthy man, with a reputation for doing the impossible. But Malcolm Bricklin didn't want to just sell other people's cars. He had the automotive fever. He wanted his own name on the hood.
Bricklin was a man of immense charisma. People who worked for him described him as a force of nature. He could walk into a room and convince anyone of anything. He was a high-stakes gambler who lived life at 100 miles per hour. However, his detractors saw something else. They saw a man who lacked attention to detail, a man who was bored by the boring parts of car manufacturing, like quality control, supply chains, and realistic budgets. He was a big-picture man in an industry where the small details are what keep the wheels from falling off. In 1971, he set his sights on his grandest vision yet. He wanted to build a car that combined the sexy styling of a Lamborghini with the safety of a tank. To do it, he would need more than just a dream. He would need millions of dollars, a world-class designer, and a place to build it. He found his designer in Herb Grass, who had worked on the original Batmobile. And he found his money in a place no one expected, the Canadian province of New Brunswick.
To build the safest car in the world, Malcolm Bricklin couldn't just use a standard chassis. He needed a fortress on wheels. In 1971, the project began under the codename Gray Ghost. The initial prototype was built by the legendary Dick Dean, a custom car builder who had worked with George Barris. The engineering philosophy was radical for its time. While Detroit was resisting safety regulations, Bricklin embraced them. The SV1 was designed around 3 pillars: a steel perimeter chassis, a massive heavy-duty frame that protected the fuel tank and the engine, the integrated roll cage, a tubular steel cage that surrounded the entire passenger compartment, in an era when convertibles were being banned because they were rolling guillotines. The Bricklin was a tank. 5-mile-per-hour energy-absorbing bumpers. These weren't the ugly rubber strips seen on other cars. They were integrated into the wedge shape, designed to recede into the body upon impact. But the most revolutionary and eventually the most problematic feature was the body. Malcolm hated paint. He thought paint was inefficient, prone to chipping, and environmentally messy. Instead, he wanted the car to be born in its final color. He pioneered color-impregnated acrylic resin bonded to fiberglass. The color went all the way through the material. If you scratched it, you didn't need a body shop. You just buffed it out. It came in 5 vibrant safety colors: safety white, safety green, safety red, safety orange, and safety suntan. By 1973, Bricklin had a design, but he had no money and no factory. He originally looked at an old Renault plant in Quebec, but the labor unions were too strong. Then a colleague whispered a name: Richard Hatfield, the premier of New Brunswick. New Brunswick was a province built on timber, potatoes, and fishing. It was an industrial backwater in the eyes of many Canadians. Richard Hatfield wanted to change that. He was a progressive, charismatic politician who dreamed of modernizing his province. He wanted New Brunswick to be known for high-tech manufacturing, not just loggers. When Malcolm Bricklin walked into Hatfield's office, it was a meeting of 2 master salesmen. Bricklin promised Hatfield thousands of jobs and global prestige. Hatfield, in turn, promised Bricklin something no one else would: the money. The New Brunswick government initially provided $4.5 million in loans and guarantees. They saw it as the ultimate economic development project. To the local people, it was a miracle. A futuristic sports car company was moving into their backyard. 2 factories were established. One in Minto to manufacture the complex acrylic body panels, and a massive assembly plant at 150 Industrial Drive in St. John. But there was a hidden danger in this New Brunswick miracle. Car manufacturing is an art that requires generations of institutional knowledge. The people of St. John were hard-working, but they weren't auto workers. They were fishermen, lumberjacks, and tradespeople who had never seen an assembly line.
Bricklin was trying to launch a brand new car with a brand new material, acrylic, using a brand new workforce in a remote location far from the Detroit supply chain. It was a recipe for a production bottleneck of epic proportions. February 1974, the Riviera Hotel, Las Vegas. This was the peak of the Bricklin dream. The SV-1 was unveiled to a stunned audience. It looked like a spaceship. With its pop-up headlights and those massive, hydraulically powered gull-wing doors, it looked like something from the 21st century. The media went into a frenzy. Malcolm Bricklin was featured on the Today Show. The car appeared on The Price is Right and Let's Make a Deal. It was featured in Playboy and People magazine. The safety angle was working. In a clever marketing move, Bricklin refused to install a cigarette lighter or an ashtray. He famously said, "You should be focused on driving, not smoking." This cemented the SV-1 as the responsible sports car. Orders began pouring in. Dealers were clamoring for the car. Bricklin announced an ambitious production goal, 1,000 cars a month. By late 1974, the first production models, powered by a thumping AMC 360 V8, began to hit the streets. For a few months, Malcolm Bricklin was the king of the automotive world. He had done what everyone said was impossible. He had built an Canadian-American, sports car from scratch. But as the first owners took delivery, the dream began to show its first cracks. The doors didn't always open. The acrylic panels began to blister, and the money that Richard Hatfield had promised was disappearing faster than anyone could have imagined.
Every engineer knows that safety and speed are often at odds. To make a car safe, you add steel. To make a car fast, you take it away. Malcolm Bricklin wanted both, but he wasn't willing to compromise on the safety. The result was a vehicle that was significantly heavier than its competitors. With the full perimeter frame, the integrated roll cage, and the heavy hydraulic systems, the SV-1 tipped the scales at nearly 3,500 pounds. For a two-seater sports car in 1974, that was a massive figure. To move that much weight, the car needed a serious heartbeat. Initially, Bricklin struck a deal with American Motors, or AMC, to supply the 360 cubic inch V8. It was a solid, reliable engine, producing about 220 horsepower. It gave the 1974 Bricklin a respectable 0 to 60 time of about 7 seconds. Not a world beater, but enough to compete with the smog-choked Corvettes of the era. But the supply chain was fragile. AMC, struggling with its own production, couldn't guarantee enough engines to meet Bricklin's ambitious goals. In 1975, Bricklin was forced to switch to the Ford 351 Windsor V8. On paper, this seemed like a lateral move, but there was a catch. The Ford engines were smog-spec units, choked by early emissions equipment. Horsepower dropped from 220 to a meager 175. Even worse, the Ford powertrain was only compatible with an automatic transmission. The 4-speed manual, the soul of any true 70s sports car, was deleted from the options list. Now you had a sports car that was heavy, underpowered, and automatic only. The excitement was beginning to evaporate before the cars even left the dealership. If the SV-1 had a signature feature, it was the gull-wing doors. They were the car's greatest selling point and its greatest liability. Unlike the DeLorean, which used light gas-charged struts to help you lift the doors manually, the Bricklin doors were electro-hydraulically operated. Each door weighed a staggering 90 pounds, largely due to the internal side impact beams. To lift them, a high-pressure hydraulic pump had to do all the work. The system was plagued with issues from day one. The power drain. The hydraulic pump pulled massive amounts of current from the battery. If you sat in the car and showed off the doors to your friends 3 or 4 times without the engine running, the battery would die. The trapped occupant. If the battery died while you were inside, you were in trouble. There was no manual override. Owners often found themselves trapped inside their safety vehicle, forced to crawl out through the small rear hatch or wait for a jump start. The pump overload. The car used a single pump for both doors. If a driver and passenger tried to open their doors at the same exact time, the system would often overheat, blow a fuse, or simply fail, leaving both occupants stuck. Furthermore, the weather stripping was abysmal. The complex curves of the gull-wing doors proved impossible for the inexperienced New Brunswick workforce to seal correctly. In a heavy rain, the Bricklin didn't just leak, it poured. Water would collect in the door sills and eventually dump into the driver's lap the moment the door was opened. Then there was the body itself. The paintless acrylic resin was supposed to be Malcolm Bricklin's greatest innovation. In reality, it was a manufacturing catastrophe. The process involved vacuum forming a sheet of acrylic and then backing it with fiberglass for strength. But the two materials had different expansion rates. When the car sat in the sun, the acrylic would expand faster than the fiberglass, causing the bond to fail. Huge bubbles, known as blisters, would appear on the hood and doors. In extreme heat, the panels could actually warp or crack. The scrap rate at the Minto factory was heartbreaking. At one point, for every 10 body panels produced, 6 were thrown away due to defects. This meant that the cost of the good panels was astronomical. Bricklin was effectively paying for 3 cars just to build one. By the time the panels reached the assembly plant in St. John, they were often scratched or chipped. Because you couldn't touch up acrylic like you could paint, the workers had to spend hours buffing out imperfections, further slowing down an already sluggish assembly line. Malcolm Bricklin's original dream was a $4,000 sports car. By the time the first 1974 models hit showrooms, the price had climbed to $7,490. By 1975, as the production costs spiraled out of control and the New Brunswick government demanded some return on their investment, the price skyrocketed to $9,980. To put that in perspective, a 1975 Chevrolet Corvette, a car with a proven dealer network, better performance, and a higher resale value, started at about $6,800. Bricklin was asking customers to pay a $3,000 premium for a car that was slower, heavier, and built by a company that might not exist in 6 months. Unsurprisingly, the dealers, who had each paid an $8,000 franchise fee to sell the car, were beginning to panic. The safety pitch was no longer enough. The public began to see the SV1 for what it was, a beautiful but deeply flawed experiment that they were being asked to fund. As the technical failures mounted, the political temperature in New Brunswick reached a boiling point. Richard Hatfield had staked his reputation on Bricklin. He had used the car to win the 1974 election, but now the opposition party was smelling blood. Rumors began to circulate about Malcolm Bricklin's lavish lifestyle. While the factory workers in St. John were struggling to build cars in a drafty warehouse, Bricklin was reportedly flying in private jets and living like a mogul. The New Brunswick government had already poured over $20 million into the project. Every time production stalled, Malcolm would fly to Fredericton and ask for another bridge loan. Hatfield, trapped in a sunk cost fallacy, kept saying yes. He couldn't afford for Bricklin to fail, because if Bricklin failed, Hatfield's government might fall with it. But the politics of fun was about to meet the reality of a global recession. The tops were about to run dry.
By September 1975, the Bricklin SV1 was no longer a miracle car. It was a political anchor dragging the New Brunswick government into the depths of a financial scandal. The province had already sunk over $20 million into the venture, an astronomical sum for a small maritime province in the 1970s. Every car that rolled off the line in St. John was a loss leader.
While it was being sold for nearly $10,000, it was costing the government nearly $16,000 to produce. The math simply didn't work. The more cars they built, the more money they lost. Malcolm Bricklin flew to Fredericton one last time. He wasn't there to celebrate, he was there to demand more money. He told Hatfield that without another $10 million infusion, the lights would go out. But Hatfield, once Bricklin's biggest cheerleader, was trapped. The opposition party was calling for a public inquiry. The taxpayers were furious. The Disco Dick era of carefree spending was over.
On September 25, 1975, the axe finally fell. The New Brunswick government refused to grant any further loans. They moved to put Bricklin Canada Ltd. into receivership. It was a chaotic, bitter end. The announcement was so sudden that many workers arrived for their morning shift only to find the gates locked by the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. There were no severance packages. There were no thank you speeches. In a final, desperate move to recoup some of their losses, the government seized everything. They seized the completed cars, the half-finished frames, the molds, and the specialized tools. The dream of a Canadian-made automotive empire had lasted just under 2 years of production.
People often ask, was the Bricklin SV1 a failure? If we define failure as the inability to sustain a business, the answer is an undeniable yes. But why did it fail? It wasn't just one mistake. It was a perfect storm of 4 critical factors. 1, the production-to-price ratio. Bricklin was selling the car at a price the market would barely tolerate, while the cost to build it was nearly double that price. No business can survive losing thousands of dollars on every unit sold. 2, the inexperienced workforce factor. While the people of New Brunswick were dedicated, they weren't auto workers. The learning curve was too steep and too expensive. The scrap rate of the acrylic panels, up to 60%, was enough to kill any manufacturer. 3, the lack of testing. The SV1 was rushed to market to satisfy political deadlines. This led to the infamous trapped door issues and the blistering acrylic. Had the car undergone 2 more years of R&D, these deal-breaker flaws might have been solved. 4, the political sinkhole. Because the company was funded by a government rather than private investors, it was subject to the whims of the election cycle. When it became a political liability, the funding was cut off instantly.
Today, the Bricklin SV1 is a cult icon. Only about 2,854 cars were ever produced, and it's estimated that roughly 1,100 survive today. The very things that made it a failure in 1975, the weird material, the bizarre doors, the safety branding, make it a treasure for collectors today. The Bricklin International Owners Club is one of the most dedicated in the world. They have spent decades re-engineering the car's flaws. Modern owners use air struts for the doors instead of heavy hydraulics and high-tech coatings to protect the acrylic. But the legacy of the Bricklin goes beyond the car itself. It served as a blueprint for another dreamer who would arrive a few years later. John DeLorean followed the Bricklin story closely. He, too, would build a gull-wing door sports car in a remote location, Northern Ireland, using government subsidies. And, tragically, he would make many of the same mistakes.
Malcolm Bricklin didn't stop. He went on to import the Yugo and later attempted to bring cherry cars from China. He remains the ultimate automotive gambler. The Bricklin SV1 stands as a monument to the 1970s, a decade of wild ambition and crushing reality. It was a car that tried to save lives, but couldn't save itself. It was a Canadian dream that proved that in the car business, it's not enough to be safe. You have to be sustainable. Every time you see a Bricklin today, you're not just seeing a car. You're seeing the physical remains of a $20 million gamble that failed to pay off, but succeeded in leaving an impermanent mark on history. The safety vehicle won. It may not have conquered the road, but it certainly captured our imagination.